Good morning everybody and welcome to today's webinar on business travel policy, risk assessment, review and inclusion policy. Today's webinar will be presented by special guest Grant Thomas, who is the Director of Special Risk at AJ Gallagher's. Before I give a brief introduction on Grant, I'm Sarah Jarvis and I'm one of the category buyers here at YPO in Corporate and Financial Services, and two of the contracts that I look after is Insurance Brokerage Framework and the Insurance Placement DPS. So a little bit of background on Grant. So as I said, Grant is a Director of the Special Risk Department at Gallagher's. It specialises in global personal accident, life and travel placement for the past 14 years. Grant has extensive expertise and involvement with higher education travel risks, working with 40+ UK-based institutions, assisting and managing the placement of policies, along with ensuring the highest level of service and coverage to meet the needs of global travelling student communities. So before we go into the webinar, I'd just like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've all joined this webinar in listening mode only. Please use the Q&A facilities at the bottom of the screen to ask questions or share your experience in the business travel. What we'll do is we'll answer as many questions as we possibly can at the end of the webinar, and for any questions unanswered we will respond to you in the next couple of days. So now I'm going to pass over to Grant to go through this webinar.
Sarah. Good morning, and thanks for the time. I hope you're all keeping positive and testing negative. So today it's just to go through travel insurance and how that can align with risk assessments, particularly knowing and having experienced issues over the past couple of months due to COVID. So with that in mind, what have been the traditional risks for travel insurance and risk? Well, predominantly in the past up until now, it's been medical expenses. So all the costs that can occur from when someone's overseas, if they become ill or have an injury, the cost of the actual trip themselves for the flights not going ahead, not being able to travel or having to come home early. And then of course your personal belongings and business equipment for your business travelers. So that would be your iPhones, your personal baggage, possibly work laptops and work phones. But then also you more severe side of things being the bodily injuries, and these can occur from anything as a road traffic accident or maybe down. Next screen, please. So taking from the risks where we are now with the new world risks and what we know, as we can see, the top two concerns almost shifted in terms of what the key risks for a travel insurance and where the financial liabilities lie with customers. Since COVID has kicked in from Asia, the late end of last year, the cancellation side of things and the financial liabilities that attach to that have been astronomical. We haven't seen as many claims for medical expenses as for cancellation ailment. Typically, customers. Yeah, I can sound is quite moment. Hopefully you can hear me now. No. I will say this was fine during the test session. Sarah, any suggestions?
Sorry Grant, you keep breaking up. It's really unbreakable. I can't hear what you're saying.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying. Is that better now? Right.
Sorry about this, everybody. We're just trying to get Grant back and get him, make sure the sound's all right. Like I says, when we did the test earlier, it was all fine.
I'll just give it a minute and hopefully that will reset itself.
You're sounding a lot better there, Grant, when you came on.
Okay, so do you think, should I go back to the previous screen if there was a bit of interruption?
Yeah, shall we just go back? I'll go back. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, then I'll just recap for those of you that weren't able to hear me so clearly. So looking at the traditional risks of a travel insurance policy and the financial liabilities that attach to them, in level of importance to customers would be the medical expenses and the claims costs that can arise for travellers when they're overseas for any bodily injuries or illnesses. Secondly, we had the costs associated with trips being cancelled or delays from departure, or trips being cut short because of any particular reasons, whether that be the illness of an insured person or their family members or personal circumstances, or even perhaps the flights were cancelled by the airlines. Then we were followed by the personal property. So these would have been your iPhones, work laptops, and particularly sometimes even jewellery. Some people like to travel with expensive jewellery, and depending on where they are in the world, these may get lost or stolen. And then at the bottom, you have the more infrequent type of incidences that come with high levels of claim costs. And these would be your bodily injuries, such as a road traffic accident for any of your travelling communities that may incur a severe injury. Next screen. Now, those were the traditional risks. And here we can see in the new world, the current world, the financial liabilities for travel insurance and the perception of the risk to customers has shifted. Originally, it would have been the medical expenses that were the prime importance for customers, but now seeing what the high levels of claims that the industry has faced, it's now the cancellation side of things that have taken the predominant and prominent role of risk perception and needs for travel insurance. I'll go into some statistics on why that may be, but as we can see, the personal property and the bodily injury, they remain quite static at the moment, but it is the financial liabilities that apply to cancellations and the disruption of travel that have taken the prime spot there. Next slide, please. Actually, if we could just go back, Sarah, I do apologise. So that, just to give an idea, typically the majority of claims under a travel insurance policy most frequently are low-level medical expenses. So these can be the frequent but low-cost claims, the trips and slips, the common cold, the snip and dribbles, whereby you can just go and see a local doctor and they'll probably charge you £100 for a consultation and administer some drugs. But then on the flip side, you do also have the more extreme cases whereby these are less frequent, but they have the higher cost, as I mentioned. So this can be, as I mentioned, a road traffic accident. Now, since the onset of COVID, the significant financial liabilities faced by organisations have been because of these trips being cancelled. I think there was a recent statistic from the IATA that they estimate that the loss to the travel industry is in the region of 82 billion globally. You may have seen also, just from experience, if you are involved in the placement and organising of travel insurances, that whilst the cancellation claims have been prevalent during the past couple of months, you may have found that a lot more work has had to be required from insurers, from their customers, to pursue the avenues, whether it be by regulation, to seek refunds from airlines and from tour operators and travel operators. And that's because a lot of regulations have been applied by UK and global governments to protect companies, entities and consumers. The main aim from insurers, whilst it has been frustrating, in my experience, it can be very frustrating having a lot of questions asked for what can be deemed as a simple cancellation claim. It's purely to mitigate their own losses against their own income, and to make sure that recoveries are given by the necessary entities where it is stipulated to do so. Next screen, please. If you can, next screen, please. I've gotten lost. There we go. So here we go, just a quick example of another financial risk that can apply to travel disruption. As we see here, we've got Flybe, who were noted as financially insolvent earlier on this year. And that again just puts a huge strain on customers and travellers, and particularly businesses who have large or even small communities of travelling members of staff or students. Because what that doesn't allow is that for the cost of tickets that have been booked with these certain providers, they can't be protected or reclaimed by those providers. And that is why we have the likes of ABTA and ATOL to protect against those instances. Next screen, please. Sorry, next screen, please. I'm hoping everybody can hear me a bit clearly now as well. So in view of all of these changing in risk and change in appetite and the change in the world, quite frankly, where do we stand as an insurance market for travel at the moment? Well, generally the top UK composite markets, as you can see there, some of you may be familiar with these and even have your own travel insurance policies with these providers. At the moment, we haven't seen many providers really follow a particular trend on excluding COVID or putting limitations onto COVID related claims. But just to run through the list and give some examples on where we find the market at the moment. AIG, for example, the first one there, they have really no changes to their policy wordings. However, we have seen them impose full COVID exclusions, particularly only to the cancellation section of policies. And that's predominantly only been coming through for education-based clients. So whether that be schools, colleges, or higher education institutions. And I think the last reported figure that we heard through the grapevine was in the high 7 figures since March. And that is, they've never really been faced with that just from a particular trade for education. Then moving on to Aviva. Aviva, we have seen them putting full COVID exclusions onto their policies. So that again, I mean, on the worst side of things, that wouldn't protect your travellers if they were to travel and contract COVID and required hospitalisation. AHU, not one of those mentioned here, they're a Lloyd's managing agency. They are also putting in full COVID exclusions across the board. We have another company, Millstream. They're avoiding exposures whereby they might have large exposure to group bookings. So this might be, again, quite related to the education space with school trips, or even tour operators that may be looking to protect their customers. AXA XL, who are noted there, they're taking a stance alongside Allianz, depending on individual trades. And again, they may look at existing group, whether they do include group bookings, but also taking a keen look onto the past claims experience, particularly since the beginning of the year, as that's always kind of a telling feature to the potential risk and the travel performance. Similar to Aviva, Allianz and Trust, they're putting COVID exclusions only for cancellation sections, and that's across the board. And I've not heard of any changes from Zurich. So likewise with AIG, they're not putting any COVID exclusions in place to their standard policy terms and conditions at the moment. Now, you may have your own policies with some of these providers, and you may have different terms and conditions, and that may be well possible. This is just a general overview on where we find ourselves at the moment on a common approach. Next screen, please. So just moving on, conscious that the topic here is risk assessments and inclusion to travel policy. So having covered off the travel policy and the state of the market, just to give a brief overview, some of you will probably be very familiar with risk assessments, but this is just to go over a top level amount of detail. So what are they? Risk assessments are a vital tool in ascertaining the associated risk for travelling communities. This information can be used to ensure all steps are taken to provide the necessary framework in order to provide the highest level of care. Risk assessment frameworks can vary quite dramatically from entity to entity, depending on each individual perception of risk. For example, a clothing line retailer undertaking regular trips to France, they would have a significant difference of perception to risk than, let's say, a global entity with maybe academics and students traveling everywhere around the world. So we may find that whilst the risk assessment guidelines are exactly the same between the two, the requirements for information may be a bit broader. They may have much stricter referral procedures. And then whilst the perception, so going from the perception of risk, one of the things that is worth noting is that the perception of risk versus actual risk may differ completely. However, the compliance of duty of care is paramount. So when I reference perception of risk, if I was to take an example, you may have a member of staff that was born and raised in Paris and undertakes regular trips back to Paris to remain with family during annual leave. They will have a completely different perception of the risks associated with Paris than, for example, someone who's never left the UK before. And it's all about making sure that every risk is considered and accounted for, regardless of individual travellers' requirements, because the actual risk is still the same. The risk of theft will still apply to a French national quite similarly to a UK national, depending on the crime statistics that the local authorities do provide. Next screen, please. So why do we have to undertake risk assessments? Well, the purpose of a risk assessment is to ensure that a workplace is safe to work in and all the individuals involved are appropriately protected from hazards. So whilst this mentions the workplace, it also can apply and does apply to your travelling cohorts. The process of a risk assessment involves firstly identifying the hazards within a workplace or travel destination, and then subsequently implementing the control procedures and measures. Risk assessment should be embedded ideally within your organisation's travel management guidelines and procedures. What a risk assessment does is it actually raises awareness to the travelling communities that additional considerations and even support may be needed when higher levels of health and safety may be of concern. So again, sticking with that actual risk topic, the actual risk for health in Paris being a very commonly, frequently visited city for many global travellers, the infrastructure in Paris is a lot stronger than the infrastructure that you might find in some remote parts of Africa. So the actual risk will differ hugely depending on where people are travelling to. Now, who does risk assessment apply to? Next screen, please. So risk assessments, who's responsible for them predominantly? Well, the responsibility of actually developing, maintaining and enforcing the necessary risk management, it can fall upon, as we've seen, as I've seen with my work with many large institutions and global organisations, the key stakeholders for this task can be one individual, or it can actually sit with various parts of a business. So here's just a couple of examples. You may find that key stakeholders with a responsibility or a need to be involved within the risk assessment process can be health and safety, occupational health, human resources, finance and procurement, legal, and even the insurance and risk manager. So again, whilst these individuals and various parts of their business may operate in a soulless environment, there is and can be a need for these people to work in tandem in a consolidated and a consistent approach, and making sure that they're aligned and have a valuable input to the risk assessment process is paramount, again, relating back to the duty of care, because the wider your risk assessment procedures are and the guidelines, and specific to your business as well, the more easy the procedures and processes will be. Next screen, please. Now, here's just a very brief example of what a risk assessment toolboard can look like. Again, a few of you on the call today may be familiar with these traffic light systems, but up the left-hand side, we can see the level of severity increasing, and down the bottom, you can see the likelihood. So the green zone are low risk, low likelihood, low severity, and the items in red are high severity and a high likelihood of occurrence. So what are the typical factors of a risk assessment that this traffic lighting system would apply to? There's quite a few, and you may again know from experience and even see them day to day in your usual business activities. But some of the accounting factors can be the location of where a traveller is going. So such as, are there any FCO advisories to particular areas? Are there local governmental restrictions to particular areas of a city to avoid by travellers? The activities, what is the traveller doing? If a traveller is just simply travelling to attend business meetings in a clerical manner, maybe host businesses in offices or in a hotel for meetings, that would be a low risk, low severity, low likelihood of an occurrence happening. However, if you are hosting school trips and taking a number of students abroad during the year, maybe they might have some activities of skiing. Well, the risk of skiing, as you are quite well aware, is higher than sitting and hosting meetings or maybe visiting museums as part of an educational trip. Other considerations, individual health requirements. Are there any instances, or are you aware of any, obviously taking into consideration the data protection laws that we have, but the consideration needs to be given by employers and their travelling communities, particularly to various parts of the world, on are there any medical conditions that travellers have that may not be so easily treatable if something were to become exacerbated or have an occurrence of. So it's again making sure that the framework is there to protect your travellers. Moving on, you may have crime levels. Are there various very high levels of crime, being theft or potential kidnaps? Kidnaps referring to Latin America in some parts, and even some parts of Africa. So are these risks being identified and being accounted for to minimise the occurrence of something happening to your travellers? Another important thing, kind of relating back to individual health requirements, is the health infrastructure of a destination being travelled to. Because again, as we see, if you have travellers visiting remote locations, the health infrastructure may be very weak compared to an individual's needs. And that might just not be their own pre-existing needs. It may be severe accidents that can't be treated in state. As we've seen in China have a very complex tiered system, and the level of care provided by local hospitals isn't up to par or even familiar with what a UK resident may be used to under NHS. So it's just making sure that the expectation of your travellers is met. Then moving on, another consideration to be given to is the transport. How are people travelling? How are people planning on getting to these destinations? Whether be using reputable airlines. Sometimes it's not even possible to use reputable airlines that are approved by global airline authorities. If you're travelling to a remote location, then it may be the only way to visit these areas by using a non-reputable airline with non-compliant aircraft, and that's something that should be definitely taken into consideration. Local politics. What are there any ongoing political instabilities going on in country? Are there any riots? Are there planned governmental strikes, or are your travellers exposed to ideals within particular countries? Do you have a community of LGBTQ plus travellers that may be targeted depending on the purpose of their trip, or them being publicly known as being LGBTQ plus? But then on the flip side, do you have any one of the occurring risks and increasing risks that we've seen over previous years are lone female travellers? And there have been companies that have been set up to identify and assist companies with their lone female travellers, because in various parts of the world, if you're a blonde female with blue eyes, you may be targeted by the locals. So there's a lot of guidance and training that can be provided for all of these areas, but this is just some of the common practices and thought processes that are given to a risk assessment that allow people to give a scoring, again, based on the likelihood and the severity of an incident occurring for any of these areas. Now, what is a good thing, tying this back to a travel insurance policy, is that a lot of travel insurance policies these days, they actually come with their own internet and mobile app support, with their own traffic lighted system. So at a click of a button, you can log on to your insurer's designated assistance app, and you can run a report for a destination, a country, and that will then give their own knowledge and educated scoring based on all of the associated risks, some of those which I've just mentioned, but also it can give their own individual scorings based on those individual considerations. Next screen. So some of the focus points for a risk assessment that I have found, having spoken to a lot of risk managers, health and safety managers and insurance managers, so the frequent questions that arise are your processes clear and concise? Are your internal escalation points established for what can be deemed as high risk trips? Are the nominated persons with the responsibility and the authority to approve travel and risk assessments appropriately qualified and or trained to undertake the task? We have had experience in the past whereby the nominated persons for screening risk assessments and actually approving trips had no knowledge of the associated risk. It was almost like a tick box exercise for them. And it clearly was being identified in organisations' travel experience for claims, because the claims were very high compared to what we would see with other similar clients. So asking the questions, it raises the awareness, and it helps organisations move forward in ascertaining a very detailed, while sometimes can be seen as complex, but it's very detailed and very comprehensive to ensure your compliance with duty of care. And the risk assessments, again, and duty of care, they really do go hand in hand. But also have any considerations as part of your risk assessment procedures being made against your existing travel insurance policies. Sometimes we find, again, that various parts of a business act in solus. So whilst you may have a risk manager or a health and safety manager approving trips and allowing trips to go ahead, these may have individual bearings on travel insurance policy conditions whereby certain factors haven't been taken into consideration. So do particular trips to various parts of the world need prior approval? And are the persons that are responsible for signing off these risk assessments and trip approvals, are they aware of any medical underwriting requirements? The reason why those questions are asked is some policies do come with pre-existing condition exclusions. So if any of your traveling community have an existing condition and whilst on a covered trip have, again, a flare up or an incident that relates to that condition, it may not be covered. So it's worthwhile just double asking yourselves, are our teams integrated and consolidated, and do you hold your regular meetings? Just to go through the finer details of how a travel insurance policy can sit hand in hand with risk assessments. Next screen, please. So I suppose one of the questions is, what are the upsides of best practice for risk assessments? So making sure that procedures are clear and concise, and having a traffic lighted system with forms being completed and signed off by persons that are competent to do so, I think is the right phrase. So the upsides are that it gives peace of mind that travellers are considerate and aware of their own risk when travelling, and subsequently given the right tools to carry out their work in a safe and knowledgeable fashion. Now, some institutions, some organisations, they don't have a requirement that individual travellers have to complete a risk assessment. For those that do have individual risk assessments completed, depending on your own risk assessment guidelines, it enforces a element of proactiveness to your travellers, whereby it gets them thinking about the relevant risks. It means that they have to go into depth and do a bit of research as to what the risks are where they're travelling. It may raise thought processes that for them that they've never even thought of before, such as what are the hospitals like in the destination. So that's the upside for the individual travellers. But for organisations that maybe hold group trips and it's just one person with authority that completes the risk assessment, it raises those questions with that person of, have they thought about the travellers that are going on the trip? Have they considered all of the elements for every individual? But again, it just enforces the proactiveness to almost go looking for information and asking questions. But also the upside is that having the clear documentation and processes, they're absolutely vital when something does go wrong. There have been numerous times that we've heard the phrase, "It won't and can't happen to me or us." And it's the usual expectation that if you do say that, it will happen to you. And we've had plenty of circumstances of that. So always expect the unexpected and ask yourselves the questions. Don't be afraid to ask yourselves questions that may seem creating a difficult environment, but asking those questions and of the relevant people, and maybe sometimes question yourselves. I know I question myself every day in what I do, and I probably do still get things wrong, but the asking your questions, but just assuming that it won't happen to you, and then not having the framework to rely upon, which is clear and concise and comprehensive, do have downfalls. And I've got a case example here, which some of you may be familiar with, is Dusek and Storm Harbour Securities back in 2016. Now, whilst I appreciate that this is a more corporate circumstance, and some of you are from the public sector or education space, it gives an idea as to where downfalls can apply. So the individual, Thomas Dusek, he actually died in a helicopter crash over the Andes on a business trip in June 2012. So he was traveling on business, he was visiting clients, I believe, in a mountainous region, and the only way that they could get there was by helicopter, supposedly. Subsequently, after Mr. Dusek's death, his wife sued the employer Storm Harbour Securities. Now, when this finally went to court, they found in Mrs. Dusek's favour, and they awarded what was reported. I've tried to research on public forums, but I don't think it was a public number. It was a 7-figure settlement for their failures of duty of care. Now, it actually subsequently referred back into their risk assessment processes, because the risk assessment wasn't considered by someone who had their own knowledge and education and training to pinpoint certain factors that could occur and potentially risk, and did risk, the traveller's life. Some of these findings were that they actually found that he was flying in a helicopter which was unsuitable for helicopter standards as required by the regulating authorities. He was travelling a route that was dangerous and was it was prominent to very swift weather changes, so heavy downpours and wind direction. And on that day, they were actually travelling in bad weather. And one of the final finding that I believe resulted in the court rewarding Mr. Dusek is that they booked the helicopter, which was publicly known to be suffering financial difficulty. Now, with the financial difficulty, that meant that they couldn't maintain an upkeep to the regular standards of their fleet. So they were actually jeopardizing their passenger safety. So those were the kind of questions that were brought into court, and the court did find, as I mentioned, the employer negligible and awarded a liability claim against them because of the failures of duty of care. Now, as an organisation or as an institution, these should all be things that are captured at risk assessment stage, because again, I don't know whether Storm Harbour maybe didn't have a procedure which meant that if you are travelling on anything other than a passenger airplane, that you need to refer it in for higher risk approval from risk managers in health and safety and occupational health. Could they have maybe found an alternative route? Could they have maybe hosted the meeting elsewhere? So this is probably one of the more extreme cases of a downfall of duty of care, which should have been protected by a risk assessment and hopefully could have been prevented. Next screen, please. Lovely picture of an alarm clock now. Not mine, I do promise you. I'm a bit more high tech than that. I use an iPhone if it's charged overnight. So from here, it's in the current climate, we're seeing a huge downturn in the number of trips being undertaken, particularly from the UK, but also globally. As I'm sure you are aware, if you have high levels of maybe earlier on this year in the early months, that you maybe had quite a frequent number of trips, and because of local UK government but also international government restrictions, it's just becoming a bit harder to be able to justify and clear a risk assessment ensuring the safety of the travellers, but also keeping a close eye on that financial consideration for trips that maybe are cancelled. Just as a side note, we had recently, over the past couple of months, we had an individual that had travelled to Australia on business. They were due to be there for 2 weeks, and the lockdowns came in during the trip, and they subsequently became stranded in Australia. So the original flights couldn't go ahead, and they were reimbursed by the airline for those. But then you're faced with an additional cost because you have an unexpected additional accommodation. You have to pay for further stays in hotels. You might have to change accommodations. You may want to look at renting an apartment for an individual. But after a certain while, I think it was about 2 months of this individual being stranded in Australia, and you might have had similar instances with people being stranded. There was a repatriation flight organised by the government, and an organisation we heard paid almost about $7,500 Australian dollars to get this member of staff on the flight. They organised all the last minute transport to the airport. They got the person through check-in, and in the waiting lounge, the flight was cancelled. And that was a large financial contribution from the organisation to ensure the safety of their traveller and get them home where you're familiar with your surroundings and supported by family and friends. And there was no compensation available for it, because even when considering against the travel insurance policy, most insurers, I believe 99% of travel insurance policies include a governmental regulation exclusion. So whilst there was a governmental repatriation by the UK government to return UK citizens, the Australian government forbid the flight to go ahead. So because of that, they couldn't pursue the airline, they couldn't pursue the government, they couldn't pursue their travel insurance because it was subsequently excluded. So with this huge downturn in travel, I think it now allows us time to maybe take stock, take a breather, and start asking the questions that maybe we haven't asked before, you haven't asked. Maybe take time to connect with colleagues in other departments that you think may or may not be involved in your risk assessment procedures, but maybe they should be included in those procedures. But with the increasing, again, the downturn of travel is, as we're seeing now, as I'm doing now, a lot of online conferencing. And that's probably going to continue for the foreseeable, again, with UK and international government restrictions. But this is a perfect opportunity to take the time to sit back, breathe, and just maybe test your procedures. That's a great way of seeing of finding any pitfalls or downfalls in your current procedures that maybe can be plugged, whether it be with additional training or talking with colleagues, maybe talking with your travel insurance providers, talking to your brokers. And these are all things that can be adapted and improved upon where necessary. And I just think that's probably, we're in unprecedented times, and I don't think we've ever really had over the past few months the amount of time that we possibly had without people traveling to really take and focus on risk assessment procedures. And there are absolutely many entities out there that are risk experts. They can come in and they can test your procedures. They can talk to you, your relevant counterparts, and what they can do, they can kind of streamline and they can improve risk assessments. So there are a couple of entities that we're aware of, and you know, I'm more than happy to maybe provide some details through Sarah and the team later on. So just to summarise, the risk assessments are a necessity. They work wonderfully and they sit hand in hand with duty of care. And they also sit hand in hand with travel insurance policies. And it's something that we should maybe all be considerate of, and taking stock, and just really talking to one another, and, you know, talk to other entities that you may know within the within maybe your purchasing consortiums. Maybe you have partner institutions or councils that you may know of, and really just kind of ask them how they behave and maybe what questions what instances or circumstances they've been faced with that necessarily you may not have been, because talking to other people and sharing experiences is of huge importance. So that's kind of just a rough idea on travel insurance and risk assessment and how they can both be in bed with each other. So I think maybe now we'll move on to any questions anyone's got.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. That was really, really interesting. I think you made some really good points there, especially now that with the number of people not travelling, it's a really, really good time to actually go back and have a look at your travel policy. Right, let's just have a look at some questions. I won't be a minute. So first of all, I will be sharing this recorded webinar. It will be in the next couple of days. So if anybody's got any questions, we'll put them to Grant now. I won't be a minute.
Are any of them, why can't I hear you?
Yeah, there's quite a few from the beginning. Has anybody got any questions that they would like to ask Grant, and use the Q&A facility at the bottom of the webinar that you could see?
I think if I can maybe just preempt a single question. One of the common and frequent questions that we're faced with is, with risk assessments, particular risk assessments, how can you comply? And we spoke about this just before the conference started. How can you comply with the ever-changing GDPR rules for individuals that may have health conditions? The purpose around GDPR is to not share information I mean, my argument is that you shouldn't be sharing information that is unnecessary to unless there is a need for it. So sometimes you may find that individuals don't declare specific conditions, but they may be quite general in the sense of, I have an ongoing condition. It's maybe a breathing condition or a heart condition. And there again, whilst there's no legal obligation for them to declare what they may have, it is paramount to try and obtain as much information as possible within the law, I must say, because ultimately that will just help as employers, as entities, or as people that may hold the duty of care over your travellers, of just ensuring, as I mentioned earlier, that the framework and the infrastructure and all of the considerations have been given prior to the trip. One of the prime examples is that medication in some parts of the world aren't known by the same name that they are in the UK. If somebody's on a regular prescription medication and it is necessary for them, if that gets lost or stolen, trying to ask for what may be known in the UK as paracetamol could be known by a completely different name by people in Thailand, for example. So just trying to find that information, particularly with regards to travel and health conditions. There are tools, as I mentioned earlier, from travel insurance assistance websites and travel apps that some of these apps do have the medical equivalency details. So it just kind of allows you to put in the forefront work and kind of prepare for the worst situations that may happen, and just build in the expectation that if it does happen, you're prepared.
Brilliant, Grant. So it doesn't look like we're getting any questions at the minute, but if anybody leaves this webinar and then something comes to them, if you want to drop us an email, and it's at insurance@ypo.co.uk, what we'll do is we'll respond to you with any questions that you have and where we can help you on this topic. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank Grant for his time this morning on being the special guest on this webinar. I found it really useful, and I hope everybody else has. We've got a couple more webinars coming up on special topics, so if you want to go to the YPO website and just have a look at the other topics that are coming up and then register for any that you are interested on, that'd be really great. So once again, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. For Grant for his presentation. I know we had a couple of hiccups right at the beginning, but we've sorted it now. And I'd like to thank everybody and have a really good day. Thanks, Grant.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Take care.